Hi, and welcome to another edition of Photoshop for Video. I'm your host, Rich Harrington, and today we're going to take a look at using depth of field blur to create backdrops for use in chroma key. So we have a backdrop here. It's just a simple photo of a locker room, and I'm going to use this to create a depth of field image that we'll use as a backdrop for keying. Now, there's a great filter in Photoshop called lens blur, but to get the most out of it, you need to make a depth matte, and this is done by using gradients. Let's go over to the channels palette here, and we will click to add a new channel. By default it's added, and it's called Alpha 1. Let's go ahead and turn all the layers back on, and you'll see it overlaid on top as a Rubylith mask. What I'm going to do now is grab the gradient tool and come up here and click, and we need to use the default black to white gradient. So if that's not loaded, we'll just click and choose Reset Gradients, and that'll take us back to default. So there we go. We're going to use the black to white gradient here, and I am going to click and draw a gradient that follows the line of the image here. So let's go ahead here and draw back and release. And you see what we did there is it made a gradient going from black to white. Now if we turn this image off, you could see that a little bit better. And let's go ahead and try that again here. We'll click and go down the center line, and we're just following that back and release. And if we look at just that channel, we get a good idea that there's a gradient here, and this is defining it. Now we can go ahead and drag a little bit more if we need to, and all we're trying to do is define that wall of lockers. Now where it's black will stay in focus, but as it falls off to white, it's going to go out of focus. Now we need to do the same thing here going the opposite direction. So let's go ahead here and we'll draw, and when we release you're going to see something. Notice that the gradient on the other side went away. That's because we drew a new gradient. What we want to do here is have these gradients combine. So instead of drawing in normal mode, I could either change the blending mode, or I could come up here and say let's go from black to transparent for the second one. Now with the black to transparent, we can go ahead and click and drag and release, and you'll see that that got added to the alpha channel. Let's just look at that alpha channel. You see we have this fade off from black to white, and we're going to use this alpha channel as the depth matte. Let's go ahead and turn that alpha channel off and turn the RGB layers back on and select the RGB layers. Now with that selected, we can go ahead and run a blur on this layer. I'll go ahead and select the layer, and let's just name this Lockers. We'll double click. There we go. And choose Filter, Blur, Lens Blur. Now the Lens Blur filter wants to use the depth of field matte here, so it's using Alpha 1 to define the blur. You're seeing the whole image here, so this outside area that's in crystal clear focus, don't worry about that. That's actually outside of the boundaries of the canvas, so it won't really affect this job. And we're getting a lot of blur there, way too much in fact. So we do want to use the alpha channel because that's defining going from in focus to out of focus, but let's back off the blur focal distance here. Take that down just a little bit. We'll go to about 80. And let's take the radius down so it's not quite so intense. There we go. And if we play with the distance here, you'll see that where it goes blurry will move along that gradient. So if we move this out here back into the 200 range, you'll see that it starts to blur out in the brighter areas. 210 in this case being pretty close to the maximum white value of 255. We can play here with the specular highlights, so if I back that down a little bit, you'll see that the lights won't bloom quite as much. And we could play a little bit here with the curvature and the radius of the blur to finesse it. Now, if I toggle that off, you'll see exactly what's happened with no blur and with the blur. Using the lens blur works very well because it allows us to define a point at the distance where the image starts to go soft. Now, a lot of times when you're using photographic plates as backdrop for keys, they just don't look realistic because things that should be farther away are just as in focus as your subject that's up close to the camera. So using this blur can make it much more believable. But again, you need the alpha channel to help define how far things are away from the virtual camera. When I'm satisfied with this here, we'll just do a couple more tweaks. There's one important option, and that is this noise slider. When you blur the image, you're going to need to put some noise back in. Now, if you overdo it, it looks completely fake, but you want to find a level of noise that seems believable and matches with the original image. So usually that's going to be somewhere between a value of 2 to 5 on a low resolution image. And then we can click OK. Now, the lens blur is applied and it works great. It's going to run on this filter, and it will take a little bit of time for the filter to apply to the image. That's because the lens blur is very complex. This is fine here, and let's go ahead and turn on our video layer. Now, we're not going to do the final chroma key inside of Photoshop here, but by using this footage layer, I could do a quick test key. Let's go ahead and choose Select Color Range, and I'll just go ahead and eyedropper on the green backdrop. If I hold down the Shift key and drag through here, we'll pick up the rest. That's pretty good. Play with the fuzziness slider here. Get that little corner down there, and I'll click Invert, and then OK. What we have now is a basic selection. Now, when the person moves around in the green screen, the selection won't move. Again, I'm not suggesting that you do the final key here in Photoshop. This is just to check to see how the background looks with footage put over it. Let's go ahead with that footage layer selected and an active selection. I can click the Add Layer Mask button. And there you go. You see that we have a filtered backdrop, and the lockers behind our subject, as they get further away in the distance, roll out of focus. And that works very, very well. I hope you enjoyed this week's edition of Photoshop for Video. We've got lots more, tons of tips, free resources, as well as a lot of information about our books and training products that you can find at the website photoshopforvideo.com. Thanks again for joining us. I'm Rich Harrington.